I'm Sophia Langford. I'm 31, a psychology professor and published author living in Portland. And last month I flew home to Chicago, not to visit my father, but to bury him, or at least try to. Because when I arrived at the funeral home, dressed in black and holding a single white lily, the kind he always gave Mom on her birthday, I was stopped at the door by a man in an earpiece. Miss Langford? I'm sorry, this is a private event. Family only. I am family, I said firmly. Edward Langford is my father. The man hesitated. Then he whispered something into his comm. Moments later, the doors opened and she appeared. Clarissa Langford, my stepmother. Blonde, sculpted, and dressed like she was walking the red carpet rather than grieving a husband. She smiled at me, that rehearsed media-ready smile, and said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "This service is reserved for named heirs. I'm afraid you're not listed, Sophia." The lily trembled in my hand, but my voice did not. "You can't be serious. I'm his daughter. I've been his daughter for 31 years. Clarissa's lips barely moved. "And yet, you weren't in the most recent version of the will." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. People turned. A few guests, old friends of my father's, shifted uncomfortably. One even started to approach, but Clarissa's lawyer, a man with a clipboard and a Bluetooth headset, stepped in front of me. "You can leave voluntarily," he said, "or we'll have to call security." I left, not because I was weak or ashamed, but because I knew something Clarissa didn't. I knew my father had left something behind, something she didn't know about. A week before he died, I got a cryptic text from Gretchen, his executive assistant of 18 years. "Your dad asked me to hold on to something, for you. He said if anything happened, I'd know when to give it to you." At the time, I had no idea what it meant. But now, as I sat in my rental car outside the funeral home, that text burned in my memory like a neon sign. I reached for my phone and called Gretchen. She answered on the first ring. Her voice was trembling. "Sophia, I was hoping you'd call." "Did he know?" I whispered. "Did he know she'd do this?" There was a pause. Then, "He suspected, and he prepared for it." The next day, we met in a parking garage near his old office. She handed me a manila envelope sealed with red wax. Inside, a USB drive, a handwritten letter, and a printed legal document bearing the insignia of a law firm I'd never heard of. And with that, my journey began. A journey that would take me from being erased at my father's funeral to standing at the head of a mahogany conference table, dropping that USB in front of Clarissa's smug lawyer and saying, "You might want to read this version of the will." Before Clarissa swept in like a storm wrapped in Chanel No. 5, it had always been me and Dad. After Mom passed away when I was 13, ovarian cancer, sudden and cruel, my father, Edward Langford, had become my whole world. He was a renowned architect in Chicago, the kind whose work made the covers of glossy magazines and the skyline more beautiful. But at home, he was just Dad. The man who cooked us pasta on Fridays, who read my early essays like they were Pulitzer contenders, who held me when I cried through my first heartbreak. He was my anchor. Every Saturday morning we had this ritual. We'd grab takeout from this tiny Cuban cafe in Logan Square, then head to his office downtown. Not because he needed to work, but because I loved watching him sketch. His hands were strong and steady, his lines purposeful. Sometimes he'd explain the thought behind a curve of a window or the slant of a rooftop. Other times we'd sit in silence, the only sounds being pencil strokes and jazz humming from the speakers. He always said architecture was about two things, structure and soul, and that people, like buildings, fall when you ignore either one. When I left for college in Oregon, I was homesick for months. He'd call every Sunday at 5 p.m. sharp. Not one call missed in 4 years. When I got my master's, he was in the front row, beaming like I'd just won the Nobel. I remember him hugging me afterward and whispering, "Your mother would have been so proud, Sophia." That night, he handed me a small velvet box. Inside was a pendant, Mom's old gold necklace, engraved with a quote she used to say whenever I doubted myself. "You see things others don't. Don't ever let them convince you you're wrong for it." I wore it every day after that. For the next several years, even after I started teaching and publishing, I made trips home. And Dad made it clear that no matter how far I went, he was still my safe place. And then she arrived. Clarissa Carlson, PR consultant, elegant, polished, always with a perfect blowout and tailored blazers that matched her lipstick. Dad met her at a charity gala he helped sponsor. I remember the first time he mentioned her. She's sharp, Sophia, worldly. She actually listens when I talk about design. I didn't roll my eyes. I didn't object. After years alone, I wanted him to find happiness. I really did. So when he asked me to dinner to meet her, I smiled, showed up early, and even brought her a small houseplant. She greeted me with air kisses and called me sweetheart, in that sugary way people use when they're sizing you up. She complimented my casual charm and asked if I'd always dressed down this much, even in academia. I laughed it off. Dad didn't, but he didn't say anything either. She moved in after 3 months, married him after 6. Things changed fast after that. The Cuban cafe visits replaced with family brunches that somehow never included me. Dad's office renovated into Clarissa's home yoga studio. Photos of Mom quietly vanished. I found one, our last family photo, shoved in the back of a guest bedroom drawer, behind Clarissa's scarves. The calls stopped coming on Sundays. When I asked Dad about it, he just said, "Things are different now, honey. Clarissa keeps me busy." He was still warm, still himself, but dimmer, like someone had turned the brightness down. Then came the health scares. At first, just fatigue, then dizzy spells. A few minor falls. Clarissa always had an explanation. "Oh, he's just tired. He works too much." Or, "He skipped breakfast, that's all." But Gretchen, his assistant, looked worried every time I visited. And Dad would squeeze my hand just a little too tight, hold eye contact just a second too long, as if trying to say something without words. One night, as I was leaving, he pulled me aside in the foyer. Clarissa was upstairs, humming along to some classical playlist. He looked me dead in the eyes and said, "If anything happens, talk to Gretchen. She'll know what to do." I thought he was being dramatic. A man in his 60s, newly remarried, adjusting to a new life. But now I see it clearly. He knew. He knew something wasn't right. And he tried, in his quiet, meticulous way, to leave behind a trail, a way back to the truth. And now it was my turn to follow it. 3 weeks before the funeral, I was wrapping up a faculty meeting when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, but then it buzzed again. And again. 3 missed calls, all from the same Chicago area code. On the 4th ring, I stepped out of the meeting and picked up. A cold voice, unmistakably Clarissa's. "Sophia, your father's at Lakeshore Medical, cardiac unit. He collapsed earlier. I'm just informing you. There's no need to rush. He's sedated." No emotion, no warmth, just facts, delivered like a business memo. And then, click, she hung up. I stood there frozen in the hallway. Something felt off, deeply wrong. I booked the first flight out of Portland and landed in Chicago that night. I didn't even stop by the apartment. I headed straight to the hospital, heart pounding, fingers numb. At the nurse's station, I gave my name and explained who I was. The nurse typed something into her screen, then frowned. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Mr. Langford's file lists Clarissa Langford as the sole medical contact. It notes he requested no outside visitors." I blinked. "That can't be right. I'm his daughter." "I understand, but we have to follow protocol. His wife has medical power of attorney." I stepped back, stunned. Around the corner, I saw Clarissa. She was standing near the vending machines, chatting casually with a young man I didn't recognize, probably one of her PR assistants. She was wearing a fitted camel trench coat and sipping coffee like she was at a networking brunch, not sitting outside her husband's ICU room. I approached, fists clenched. "Why did you tell them not to let me in?" She didn't flinch, just turned slowly, raised a perfectly arched brow, and said, "Edward was very clear. He needs rest. And peace, not drama." "Drama? I flew across the country, Clarissa." She sipped her drink. And now that you've seen for yourself that he's being cared for, perhaps you'll let the professionals do their job. A man in a suit, probably her lawyer, stepped between us, offering me a polite but firm, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." I didn't. I planted myself in the waiting room and sat for hours, watching nurses come and go. I caught a glimpse of Dad once, pale, still, tubes in his arms, but was pushed back before I could reach the room. The next morning, a nurse named Tara quietly sat beside me. "You're his daughter, right?" "Yes, Sophia. He's been asking for you. In between sedatives, he keeps mumbling your name." My throat tightened. "Can I see him?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "The chart says no outside visitors by proxy request." His wife signed it. I was helpless, powerless. Every legal right had been signed away, but I wasn't going anywhere. Over the next 2 days, I stayed nearby, sleeping in a chair, charging my phone at the nurse's station, begging anyone to let me in. No one did. And then, on the third morning, my phone rang at 6:12 a.m. It was a hospital number. "Ms. Langford, this is Dr. Riley. I'm so sorry. Your father went into cardiac arrest early this morning. We attempted resuscitation for 12 minutes, but he passed at 5:47 a.m. The floor dropped from beneath me. I never got to say goodbye. The man who raised me, who whispered bedtime stories about buildings and soul and purpose, who taught me what it meant to think deeper and love harder, was gone. And I hadn't even been allowed to hold his hand one last time. Clarissa made sure of that. I didn't cry right away. Not when Dr. Riley told me. Not when I stood in the fluorescent-lit hallway, phone still clutched in my hand, heart screaming behind a frozen chest. I just stood there, silent, while the world moved around me in a blur of white coats, beeping monitors, and coffee carts. Grief hadn't hit me yet. Shock was still doing its job. I found my way to a bench near the elevators, staring out a narrow window that looked over the hospital parking garage. It was still early, the sky a murky gray with streaks of dawn just beginning to crawl in. I don't know how long I sat there, long enough for my legs to go numb. Then, without thinking, I got up and walked, straight to the ICU ward. I knew I didn't have permission. I knew I was still not listed. But I also knew that if I didn't see him, if I didn't look at him one last time, I'd never believe it was real. And I needed it to be real. But Clarissa was ready for that. 2 security guards were stationed near the entrance of the ICU wing. One of them, the same man who had blocked me from the funeral weeks later, recognized me and gave a small shake of his head. "She said you might try this." She, of course, meant Clarissa. "She also said your presence would upset the staff, and that your father requested privacy in his final hours." I laughed, not because it was funny, because it was insane. "My presence would upset the staff?" I snapped. "His daughter's presence?" But they didn't care. They were just following orders. And legally, those orders were valid. Clarissa had medical power of attorney. Dad had signed it over a year ago, likely thinking it was just paperwork. A precaution. He'd never imagined it would be weaponized to shut out the person who loved him the most. That night, I didn't go to a hotel. I slept in my car. It was a stupid idea in the middle of February, but I needed to be close. I parked in the far corner of the lot behind the hospital, curled up in the back seat of my rented sedan, and stared at the top floor of the building, where I imagined his room had been. I talked to him in my head, told him I was sorry, told him I tried, told him I would make it right. The next morning I went back in, this time not to fight, but to ask, beg, if I had to. I found a nurse near the elevator, a tall, red-haired woman in her 50s who looked like she had seen too much and had no time for nonsense. Her badge read L. Monroe, RN. "Ma'am," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "My father, Edward Langford, passed this morning. I'm his daughter, and I just need to know, was he alone?" Her eyes softened. "I remember him," she said. Quiet, polite, very fond of his architecture books. She paused, then added, "Yes, he was alone." I swallowed the sob clawing its way up my throat. "Did he Say anything? Before? She hesitated. We're not supposed to share patient conversations without clearance. Please. I'm not asking for anything medical, I just… Did he say my name? Another pause, then she nodded. Several times, in the early morning, just Sophia, over and over, like he was trying to call someone. That broke me. Tears burst from my eyes like a dam had cracked. I turned away, embarrassed, but Nurse Monroe just stood beside me and said nothing. Her presence was kind, solid, the kind of presence Clarissa could never fake. He loved you, she said finally. You should know that. I do, I whispered. I really do. The funeral was announced 2 days later via a mass email blast sent by Clarissa's office assistant, not even Clarissa herself. No personal call, no text. Just, a memorial service honoring the life of Edward Langford will be held at Bellevue Memorial Chapel on Friday. Formal attire requested. Not beloved father. Not survived by daughter Sophia. Just efficient erasure. Efficient. I RSVP'd. Even though I knew Clarissa wouldn't want me there. Even though I knew she'd do everything in her power to make me invisible. But I wasn't going to let her win. Because even if I wasn't in her version of the story, I was still in his. And I had the letter, I had the USB, and I had the truth. Bellevue Memorial Chapel looked more like a luxury wedding venue than a place to grieve. All soft lighting, white roses, glass walls, and a piano player softly tapping out an instrumental version of What a Wonderful World. It was exactly the kind of event Clarissa would stage, elegant, curated, and cold. Not a single thing about it reflected my father's warmth, his quiet sense of humor, or the jazz he loved. I walked in wearing Dad's favorite color, navy, not because anyone had asked, but because I wanted some part of him with me. He used to say it was the color of trust, of midnight plans and deep oceans. The usher barely acknowledged me. Guest list? He asked, flipping through a clipboard. Sophia Langford, I replied firmly. His eyes scanned quickly. Then he looked up, confused. I don't see that name here. I'm his daughter. He paused. His lips parted like he wanted to say something. Maybe sorry, but didn't. Instead, he gestured to the last row in the chapel. You can take a seat. In the back. The back. Of my own father's funeral. I took the seat in silence. A few heads turned. A couple of Dad's old colleagues gave me small nods of recognition. One older man, Mr. Caldwell, Dad's former business partner, actually stood up, came to me, and squeezed my hand. Glad you came, he whispered. But Clarissa? Clarissa didn't even look at me. She sat in the front row, draped in a flowing black dress with sleeves that looked like they belonged on a runway. A lace veil barely covered her perfect makeup. Her stepson Dylan, the one I'd only met once, sat beside her, jaw tight, eyes down. He hadn't acknowledged me when I arrived, and I didn't blame him. I doubted he had any idea how deep this went. The eulogy began. Clarissa stood, collected, hands folded like a politician's wife. Her voice trembled in the rehearsed way people do on TV. Edward was the great love of my life, she began. He was a visionary, a partner, a father figure to my son. He welcomed us into his heart, his home, and made us whole. Not once did she mention me, not even the word daughter. It was as if I had never existed. I gripped the program in my lap so tightly it crumpled. The image of Dad on the front, a black and white portrait from an architecture gala 2 years ago, stared back at me. This was not the goodbye he deserved. Clarissa went on about Edward's generosity, his career, how he loved Lake Geneva weekends and Pinot Noir. That made me laugh bitterly under my breath. He hated wine, said it gave him migraines. His drink of choice was always bourbon. Neat. When it was time to approach the casket, Clarissa's brother, a man I barely remembered, physically stepped in front of me. Family first, he said with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. I am family, I replied coldly. He didn't move. By the time I made it to the front, the casket was already closing. My last glimpse of Dad was of white silk lining and a sliver of his navy suit. I whispered, "I'm sorry, Dad," and stepped back. At the reception afterward, a catered event held in a rooftop space overlooking the Chicago River, I stood near the window, away from the crowd, watching the city lights blur through tears I refused to let fall. I overheard Clarissa talking to a man in a gray suit, a lawyer by the sound of it. "We'll proceed with the reading Tuesday," he said. "All the documents are in place. He left everything in order." Clarissa nodded. "Good. Edward was very specific about his wishes. Everything's exactly how he wanted it." I nearly choked on my water. Everything he wanted? The man who used to pause his meetings just to pick up my calls? The man who called me his best design? The man who, just months ago, whispered, "Talk to Gretchen. She knows what to do." No, this wasn't what he wanted, and I wasn't going to let it end here, with me erased, silenced, and boxed out by someone who didn't even know what bourbon he drank. I stepped away from the window, my jaw set. She thought she'd won, but I had the USB. I had the letter, and I had 3 days until the reading. 3 days. That was all the time I had until the will reading Clarissa believed she had stage managed to perfection. 3 days to figure out what Dad had really wanted, and whether I had enough to prove it. I called Gretchen the next morning from the hotel lobby, using a burner number out of pure instinct. Clarissa had eyes everywhere, and the last thing I needed was to give her a reason to tighten the noose. Gretchen answered after one ring. "Sophia, I was beginning to worry." Her voice was soft but edged with urgency. She gave me an address, a quiet tree-lined street in Evanston, and asked me to meet her in an hour. "Park 2 blocks down," she said. "I've seen Clarissa's car patrol this area more than once." That wasn't paranoia. That was survival. I followed her instructions exactly. When she opened the door, Gretchen didn't look like the composed assistant I remembered from my childhood, the one who wore cashmere scarves and organized Dad's entire life like a machine. She looked tired, thinner, as if she hadn't slept in weeks. She led me into a small cluttered office just off the kitchen. Books, files, and legal pads were stacked in neat towers, but the centerpiece was sitting in the middle of the coffee table, a small wooden box. "Your father gave me this 7 months ago," she said quietly. "He made me swear not to hand it over unless something happened to him, and, well," she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I sat down and opened the box with trembling hands. Inside was a navy envelope sealed with a wax stamp, Dad's old architectural firm's logo, and a USB drive taped to a card labeled simply, "Play me first." There was also a handwritten letter, thick and creased at the corners. My name was written across the front in my father's unmistakable penmanship. "Sophia, if you're reading this, then I failed to stop what I feared most. And I'm so sorry. I've made mistakes. In love, in trust. I wanted to believe Clarissa was the person she presented to the world. But I know now that charm can be a mask. I should have listened to you sooner. This past year I felt myself slipping, mentally, physically, and at first I thought it was age. But then things started to disappear. My prescriptions changed without my approval. People I trusted stopped calling. My own memories felt like strangers in my mind. So I began keeping records. You'll find the rest on the drive. It contains copies of the updated will, filed through an independent attorney Clarissa doesn't know about, and something more important, the truth. The real estate doesn't matter, the shares don't matter, but you do. You are your mother's daughter. Sharp, kind, unshakable, and you deserve to know the full picture. Forgive me for not doing this face to face. I love you, Dad." Tears streamed down my face as I held the letter against my chest. It still smelled faintly like the cologne he wore, the one Mom picked out for him decades ago. Gretchen handed me her laptop and inserted the USB. The file titled Statement began with a video recording. My father sat in his study, back straight, eyes sharp. "This is Edward Langford," he said calmly. "And if you're watching this, then my suspicions have become realities." He went on to explain that 6 months prior, He began documenting irregularities in his medical treatment. His blood pressure meds were replaced with a different dosage. His vitamin supplements, which he never approved changing, had labels that didn't match what was prescribed. I confronted Clarissa once. She laughed, said I was being paranoid, but she's too smooth, too careful. So I pretended to drop it and started recording. The next folder contained audio clips, grainy but clear. One was a conversation between Clarissa and her son Dylan in the kitchen. Clarissa: "Just give him the blue ones first. They'll knock him out enough to keep quiet." Dylan: "Are you sure this isn't too much?" Clarissa, coldly: "He signed the power of attorney, didn't he? Let him sleep." My stomach turned. There were photos, too. Time-stamped shots from a private investigator Dad had hired. Clarissa meeting with someone labeled J. Wexler, the same man she once claimed was her estranged cousin. Turns out he was her first husband. Not ex-husband. Current husband, still legally married, living under a different name in Canada. The final document was a PDF of Dad's updated will, signed, notarized, and filed with Davidson & Kerr, LLP, a small but reputable firm specializing in elder protection. It stated clearly, Clarissa Langford would receive a modest monthly stipend. Dylan would have a trust fund capped at $75,000 for education. The family estate, company shares, and charitable foundations would go to me. A clause at the end instructed a full toxicology screening and an official investigation if his death occurred under unusual or medically inconsistent circumstances. I sat back, heart pounding. This wasn't just a case of being written out of a will. This was strategic abuse, coercion, fraud, and possibly something worse. Clarissa had no idea this evidence existed, but she was about to find out. The will reading was scheduled for 2:00 p.m. at the offices of Grayson & Banks LLP, one of the most expensive legal firms in downtown Chicago, and the same one Clarissa used for her PR clients and property acquisitions. When I walked into the marble-floored lobby, dressed in a charcoal blazer and navy blouse, the receptionist barely looked up. "Name?" "Sophia Langford." A pause. Her smile stiffened. "I don't believe you're on the list for this meeting, Ms. Langford." "I'm Edward Langford's daughter," I said calmly, "and I have a legal right to be here." She tapped a few keys, murmured something into a headset, and within moments, a tall man in a tailored gray suit walked briskly toward me. Mr. Harmon, Clarissa's lawyer. "Miss Langford," he said, with the tone of someone who'd rather be dealing with a wasp infestation. "This meeting is limited to the named heirs of Mr. Langford's estate. Your stepmother, Mrs. Langford, has made that very clear." I met his eyes. "Then let's hear it from her directly." Before he could respond, the conference room door opened, and Clarissa stepped out. She looked surprised to see me, but only for a split second. Then that smug, too sweet smile curled onto her lips. "Sophia," she said, her voice dripping with feigned sympathy, "I wasn't expecting you today." I shrugged. "I figured you wouldn't. You're not mentioned in the will. I thought it might be too painful for you." "Painful?" I echoed. "We'll see." Her smile faltered. "Just slightly." Harmon stepped aside. "If you insist, we can allow you to sit in, as long as there's no disruption." "Oh," I said, stepping past them. "I wouldn't dream of it." The conference room smelled like polished wood and perfume. Clarissa sat at the head of the table, flanked by Dylan and her brother Marcus, both dressed for court rather than grief. A young paralegal arranged stacks of documents, while Mr. Harmon cleared his throat dramatically and began. "We're here to read the last will and testament of Edward Langford, dated August 14th of last year. As per the document..." I tuned out the legal jargon, focusing on the details. Clarissa received the entirety of the estate: the house, the business holdings, the art collection, the investment portfolio. Dylan was listed as a secondary beneficiary if Clarissa were to pass before distribution. It was all very neat, very airtight, and very, very fake. When Harmon finished, Clarissa dabbed the corner of her eye with a tissue, then turned to the room and said, "Edward wanted everything simple. No drama, no fights over money." I let the silence stretch. Then I calmly opened my bag and placed a sealed envelope on the table. What's that? Clarissa asked, her voice flat. A copy of Dad's real will, I replied, filed with Davidson and Kerr LLP 6 months ago, with video evidence, witness affidavits, and a notary seal. The room went still. Harmon blinked. Excuse me? I slid the envelope across the table. This supersedes what you just read. Clarissa stood so fast her chair screeched backward. That's absurd. That firm isn't even. Edward would have told me if he changed anything. Exactly why he didn't, I replied. She reached for the document with trembling hands, but Harmon snatched it first and opened it. His face went pale as he skimmed the contents. This revokes all prior wills. It leaves the majority of the estate to. He looked up. Me, I said. Clarissa's mouth opened, but no sound came out. And, Harmon added reluctantly, there's an investigative clause. If Mr. Langford's death is considered unusual, a medical review and toxicology report are to be authorized by the executor. Clarissa's carefully crafted mask shattered. What are you implying? She hissed. That I hurt my own husband? I'm not implying anything, I said, sliding a second envelope across the table, this one containing the printed screenshots from the USB recordings. But this might? She didn't touch it. But her brother did, just long enough to see the photos of her and Jay Wexler, her still-married husband. You said he was dead, he muttered, recoiling. Clarissa spun toward him. Don't start. You don't understand. Oh, I understand, I said. I understand that you used your power of attorney to change his medication. I understand that you tried to erase me from his life and then from his death. But the truth? I leaned forward, looking her in the eye. It doesn't stay buried forever. Clarissa's hand trembled as she clutched her purse. Her face twisted between fury and panic. This isn't over, she whispered. No, I said, rising from my seat. It's just beginning. The will reading should have been the end of it. But Clarissa Langford wasn't the type to bow out gracefully. She was the kind of woman who turned endings into explosions. And she was just getting started. By the time I returned to my hotel that night, my inbox was already flooded. Emails from my father's business partners, family acquaintances, even alumni from his old college, all with subject lines like, "Saw the news, is this true?" "Clarissa says you manipulated your father?" "Call me, I'm hearing strange things." The next morning, the local business paper ran a story. Langford legacy disputed, daughter challenges widow's inheritance amid allegations. Clarissa had made sure the media got her version first, that I had swooped in after years of estrangement, taken advantage of a grieving man in his final months, and stolen what rightfully belonged to her and Dylan. I stared at the screen in disbelief. She's playing dirty, I muttered. Gretchen, who had come by to check in, nodded grimly. And she's only warming up. We spent that day compiling backup files. I made multiple encrypted copies of the USB, stored them in separate cloud folders, and delivered one physical backup to Caroline Dent, the estate litigation attorney I'd just hired. Caroline had gray-streaked hair, no-nonsense heels, and the energy of a woman who'd turned courtroom losses into career-ending counterattacks. She read everything, the will, the audio recordings, the PI photos, and then calmly said, "Your father was smart and thorough. This gives us leverage not just in probate court, but potentially in criminal court too." But she warned me too. Clarissa's going to try to bury you under a mountain of delay tactics, counterclaims, and public smear. Be ready. I didn't have to wait long. That night, I came back to my hotel to find the door slightly ajar. I froze. I knew I'd locked it. Triple-checked, in fact. I stepped inside slowly, heart pounding. Nothing was obviously gone, but everything felt touched. My suitcase was unzipped. My laptop was closed, though I'd left it open. The drawer I'd kept Dad's medical records in was half open, and one folder, the one labeled RX Timeline, was gone. I backed out of the room, hands shaking, and called hotel security. They checked the footage. Sure enough, a man in a maintenance uniform had entered my room 2 hours earlier. No name, no ID, and conveniently, his face was always angled away from the camera. "Staff has no record of anyone sent to that floor," the manager said nervously. I, I'm sorry. I changed rooms, booked under a different name, bought a personal security camera and a door wedge alarm. I wasn't paranoid. I was prepared. Because the next morning, a text arrived from an unknown number. Back off or regret it. An hour later, an email. You're being watched. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Attached were grainy photos of me leaving the law office. Another from me sitting at a coffee shop with Gretchen. They weren't just threatening me, they wanted me to know they were close. But that fear, that tight grip around my lungs, it didn't freeze me this time. It fueled me. 2 days later, something unexpected happened. Dylan messaged me. Need to talk. Not with my mom. Meet me at the Hayworth Cafe. 9 tomorrow. Alone. I hesitated. It could have been a trap. But something told me it wasn't. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat in a booth near the back facing the entrance. Dylan came in alone, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. Hoodie, dark circles under his eyes, and hands jammed into his jacket like he was hiding from the world. He sat across from me without a word for a long moment. Then he said, "She's losing it." I stayed silent. "She's drinking all day," he continued, eyes darting, "making frantic calls, shredding stuff. She keeps saying your dad betrayed her, that it was all a setup." I folded my arms. "And you?" He stared at the table. "I don't know what to believe, but I found something. Bottles in her bathroom, pills with your dad's name, labels torn off." My stomach dropped. "You understand what that means, right?" I said. He nodded. "I'm not stupid, but she's my mom." He looked up finally, and I saw real fear in his eyes. "I won't lie for her. I won't help her. But if this goes to court, I'll tell the truth." It wasn't an alliance, but it was something. Later that night, Gretchen texted me. "There's more. I didn't tell you everything before. Your father suspected her marriage wasn't legal, and he might have proof." I stared at the message. So this wasn't just about inheritance. It was about fraud. Big fraud. And if we could prove Clarissa was never legally married to Dad, everything she thought she owned would collapse like one of his old buildings, demolished from the inside. I smiled. Let her play dirty. I had truth, evidence, and one hell of a legal team. And now, I had her son too. The preliminary probate hearing was held exactly 22 days after the will reading. By that point, Clarissa's media campaign had shifted into full throttle. She appeared in a glossy feature for Chicago Weekly titled "The Widow Silenced," where she posed in soft lighting beside Dad's favorite leather armchair, a chair I knew she'd hated and once tried to replace. She told the reporter I was an emotionally distant daughter who tragically couldn't accept her father's new family. She called the will a cruel forgery, and she ended with this line: "I don't blame Sophia. Grief makes people desperate." That word, desperate, stuck with me, because standing outside the Cook County Courthouse in a navy pantsuit with Dad's letter in my bag and Gretchen at my side, the only thing I felt was clarity. Not desperation, not doubt. Clarity. We were called to courtroom 4C, Judge Helena Strauss presiding. A woman in her late 50s with no jewelry, no-nonsense glasses, and a reputation for having zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. Clarissa sat across the aisle from me, her platinum hair in a perfect chignon, flanked by Martin Drake, a high-powered estate attorney known for defending corrupt CEOs and reality TV divorces. He gave me a smile like I was already defeated. I didn't smile back. Judge Strauss opened with a warning. "We will treat this like what it is, a question of legal validity. If I sense games, manipulation, or intimidation, I will not hesitate to hold counsel in contempt." Clarissa blinked. Drake adjusted his cuffs. Let the games begin. Drake went first. He claimed my father was in mental decline, that he was easily influenced in his final months, and that Clarissa had acted out of love by managing his affairs responsibly. He waved a stack of carefully curated medical records, all obtained through Clarissa's team, suggesting Dad had been diagnosed with early-stage cognitive impairment. But Caroline, my lawyer, leaned in and whispered, "Wait for it." She stood and then destroyed them. She presented an affidavit from the physician who didn't work with Clarissa, Dad's longtime private doctor, stating that Edward Langford had no signs of dementia in the last year of his life. She showed the updated will, notarized, with independent witnesses and timestamps. She submitted the video of Dad himself explaining the changes. But the turning point? That came when Dylan Langford stood up. Clarissa whipped her head toward him like he'd just betrayed an entire bloodline. He hesitated, then walked slowly to the witness stand. "My mom. She's not who she says she is," he said. You could hear a pin drop. He described the bottles in the medicine cabinet, the shredded documents in the fireplace, the screaming fits, and worst of all, a conversation he overheard between Clarissa and her friend, James. I heard her say, "If he doesn't sign, we up the dosage. Let him sleep through the next few days." The courtroom gasped. Clarissa hissed, "Dylan?" Like a viper caught mid-strike. Judge Strauss banged the gavel. "Mrs. Langford, one more outburst, and I'll have you removed." Dylan sat down, head low, but he'd done what he needed to do. He'd told the truth. Next, Gretchen took the stand. She described how Dad began documenting strange incidents. Pills missing, confusion after meals, Clarissa's increasingly secretive behavior. She submitted the logs he'd written, the email trails, the USB, and photos of the sealed will. But it was the video, the one of Dad sitting in his study, that silenced the room. "If anything happens to me," he said clearly into the camera, "I want Sophia to know. I never intended to leave her out. Clarissa has hidden things. If this recording is being played, then I didn't make it in time." Clarissa stared straight ahead. No blinking, no breathing, just silence. Caroline closed with a line that gave me chills. "This is not about a family disagreement. It's about coercion, fraud, and control. It's about a woman who tried to rewrite a man's legacy and erase his daughter from existence." After a brief recess, Judge Strauss returned with her ruling. The updated will, dated October 12th, is found to be valid and enforceable. Mrs. Clarissa Langford is removed as executor, effective immediately. Sophia Langford is to assume that role, per Mr. Langford's instructions. She paused, then added, "This case is also being referred to the state attorney's office for further investigation under suspicion of elder abuse, medical fraud, and misrepresentation of marital status." Clarissa gasped, but no one comforted her. Not Drake, not Marcus, not even Dylan. As she was escorted from the courtroom, not in handcuffs, not yet, she turned to me and whispered, venomous and raw, "You think this is over?" I met her eyes. "No, Clarissa," I said calmly. "I think it's finally begun." After the court ruling, I thought the hardest part was over. But as my father used to say, the walls don't fall all at once. The foundation cracks first. And Clarissa's foundation? It was about to crumble. The state attorney's office opened a formal criminal investigation within 48 hours of the judge's referral. My attorney, Caroline, handed over everything. The video, the USB files, Dad's handwritten notes, medical records with inconsistencies in prescriptions. And, most damning of all, the conversation between Clarissa and Dylan, caught on Dad's office recorder. But what shocked everyone was what they uncovered next. The marriage was a lie. A week into the investigation, Caroline called me. Her voice was sharp but controlled. "Sophia, the marriage certificate Clarissa filed with the city was never finalized. She submitted the application, but the final notarized version was never returned. And here's the kicker." She paused. I could almost hear her raise an eyebrow. Clarissa was never legally divorced from her first husband, the one she called the monster who abandoned her. His name was James Wexler, and he wasn't just alive. He was living in Nova Scotia under a different name, receiving regular wire transfers from a C. Langford Holdings account. Clarissa had staged a public persona of a grieving widow, a self-made woman who had nursed her husband through illness, when in fact, she had never even been his legal wife. Without a legal marriage, she had no claim to his estate. None. The entire case shifted in that moment. The judge's civil ruling had already given me control over the estate, but now the fraud charges were in motion. The medical evidence. A forensic pharmacologist reviewed Dad's blood work and prescriptions. Thanks to a nurse who had stored a sample, part of a hospital research initiative, there was still enough for a tox screen. The results? Elevated levels of lorazepam, temazepam, and digoxin, drugs he hadn't been prescribed in those combinations. Sedatives, tranquilizers, heart regulators. Enough, the toxicologist said during our follow-up call, to disorient him consistently. Maybe not kill, but enough to make him question his own memory. It was calculated, methodical. Clarissa hadn't needed to hurt him to win. She just needed him confused enough to sign anything she put in front of him. The witnesses speak. After the ruling, people started talking. The private nurse, who'd been mysteriously fired a month before Dad's final hospitalization, came forward. She admitted Clarissa insisted on administering all medication herself and refused to let the nurse enter the kitchen where the pills were kept. One of Dad's longtime golf friends told investigators he'd been banned from visiting the house, without notice, and once heard Clarissa berate Edward behind a closed door. "You're too old to know what's best anymore. Let me handle things." And then came Lindsay, James Wexler's niece, and Clarissa's former housekeeper. She told police she'd overheard Clarissa and James arguing just days before Dad's death. "You said he'd be gone by now," James snapped. "It takes time," Clarissa replied. "Do you want this money or not?" That audio, recovered from an old phone backup Lindsay had saved, sealed the case for the arrest. Clarissa was arrested in her Lakeshore condo exactly 31 days after the court ruling. She was charged with felony fraud, medical coercion, elder abuse, attempted estate theft, conspiracy to defraud, and obstruction of justice. James Wexler was arrested in Nova Scotia under a separate extradition order. Clarissa's face was plastered across every news outlet by morning. Fake wife, real crimes, the heiress who wasn't. Chicago widow faces 30 years in prison for estate fraud. And just like that, her designer mask, built from lies, seduction, and precision manipulation, cracked in full public view, rebuilding the ruins. I spent the next several weeks sorting through my father's belongings, now legally mine. At the back of his study bookshelf, behind a false panel, I found a series of old video journals he'd recorded in secret. Some dated back years, but one, timestamped just 8 weeks before his death, stopped me cold. He looked thinner, his eyes tired but lucid. "Sophia, if you're seeing this, then I wasn't fast enough. But I know you. I know you'll find the truth. I just hope it doesn't take too much from you to do it." I cried for hours after watching that, not just for what I'd lost, but for what he'd seen coming and how much he still believed in me to finish what he couldn't. 6 months after Clarissa's arrest, I stood in the living room of my childhood home, barefoot on the warm hardwood floor, surrounded by everything she had tried to erase. And everything I had reclaimed. The cold, modern furniture she brought in was long gone. In its place were the things that mattered. Mom's handmade quilt draped over the reading chair. Dad's jazz vinyls stacked neatly beside the old record player. The framed blueprints of his first major building, the one he designed the year I was born, back on the wall where they belonged. And in the center of the room, facing a restored fireplace, sat the Langford Foundation Charter, signed and sealed. Instead of selling off the estate like the original will suggested, I had worked with Caroline and Dad's former board of directors to transform it into something bigger, a philanthropic trust named after both my parents, the Langford Foundation for Ethical Architecture and Elder Advocacy. Its mission? To fund young architects who designed with community, not just profit in mind. To support elder abuse prevention programs, especially for those without family to fight for them. It felt like purpose. It felt like him. Dylan Dillon testified during the criminal trial. His words, honest, halting, played a key role in solidifying the case. Afterward, I didn't hear from him for weeks. Then, one Sunday afternoon, he showed up at the house. He stood awkwardly on the porch, holding a brown envelope. I thought you should have this, he said. Inside were a handful of old photographs I'd never seen. Dad and me on his sailboat, Mom holding me at age 5, Dad standing behind me at my college graduation, taken from the audience, when I didn't know he was there. She kept them in a locked drawer, Dylan murmured. Said they didn't fit the decor. I looked at him and saw a boy who'd grown up in the shadow of manipulation, finally stepping into the light. Thank you, I said softly. You helped bring her down. Don't forget that. I didn't do it for you, he replied. Then after a pause, I did it for him. Fair enough. Before he left, I gave him something too. A letter Dad had written for him, found in a separate folder on the USB drive. He didn't open it in front of me, but I saw tears in his eyes as he walked away. Closure and something more. The criminal trial ended with Clarissa's conviction on 5 felony counts. She was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 19. James Wexler took a plea deal in exchange for testifying and was deported permanently. The judge called it one of the most methodically cruel betrayals of trust she'd ever presided over, but no sentence could return what was lost. The months I could have had with Dad, the calls I never got to return, the final goodbye I was robbed of. Still, in a strange way, justice gave me something else. Peace. The kind that doesn't come overnight, or with court rulings. The kind that grows quietly, like ivy returning to an old garden wall. 1 year later. On the anniversary of his passing, I stood alone at Dad's favorite lakeside bench, just outside the city. I brought 2 things with me. A letter I'd written, telling him everything that had happened, and one of Mom's white lilies wrapped in blue ribbon. I placed them side by side, closed my eyes, and let the wind carry whatever it wanted. Then I whispered, "Your story was told, your truth was heard, and your legacy, our legacy, lives on." To you, listening now. If you've ever been pushed aside by your own family, gaslit into silence, or told you don't belong, let this be proof that you do. That the truth, no matter how deeply buried, wants to be found. That love, real love, leaves behind fingerprints even lies can't smudge. And if someone has tried to erase your name from the narrative, write it back in boldly, permanently, just like I did, because sometimes the most powerful inheritance is the strength to fight for what was yours all along.